Welcome to The People's View, a program dedicated to discussing local, state, and national issues and their effect on the American people. The People's View provides a platform for state representatives and national figures to present their viewpoint. Whether it's social, economic, or financial topics, you'll hear it on The People's View.
Hello and welcome to The People's View. I'm Carl Seidel, a co-host, and today we have Charlie Arlinghaus from the Center for Politics. Charlie, welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, you're a repeat visitor, and we'd like to have you lots here because you're really up on what's happening in Concord. But first, can you tell us a little bit about your organization there?
Sure. The organization is and I think people will end up seeing this on their screen, but it's the Josiah Bartlett Center. We're named after a former New Hampshire governor. In fact, while he was chief executive of the state, they changed the title from president to governor in the 1790s, and he signed the Declaration of Independence, which is where we got the name. But we're a free market think tank. We examine state policy and state decision making, mostly what happens in Concord, some local policy, from a market-oriented perspective, which you can think of as sort of economically conservative, if you will. But we try to keep an eye on what's going on in state government and try to explain some of the more complicated things that maybe people don't understand.
Well, you're president, and you have a couple of people in that organization working, and what do they do?
Well, we all sort of do the same thing, and which is a bunch of different things. We try to keep an eye on our big areas are education policy, healthcare policy, and the state budget, or fiscal policy, if you will. And so each of us at any given time is working on, 2 or 3 different things and trying to keep tabs on what's going on. And then at the same time, trying to keep the organization afloat. We don't have a rely on big government grants or any public money actually at all. And it's all individual contributions, which we have to raise every year. So we have to sing for our supper, as they say.
So you have that's one of the reasons you have a website too.
It's one of the reasons we have a website. And frankly, if anyone wants to look at things we've done over the years or find out more about some of the things we do, jbartlett.org, and at some point that'll appear on your screen as well.
And you also have some public hearings there, or whatever you want to call them.
Well, occasionally we'll do like a forum, like one of the things that we do, and they're catch as catch can. Depends on the issue and whether we think it merits it, whether we're adding value to the debate. Anytime
if the timing's right and all that.
Yeah, if the timing's right. If the legislature's doing these 4 things anyway, we don't want to just repeat something they already did. But sometimes you don't. One of the things we do that's a constant is every year, shortly before the election, we hold a briefing mostly for people running for office, but anybody is welcome at it. So it's every other year, but about how to understand the state budget. It's the biggest document in government. It's very poorly understood. It's very hard to understand. Where you find the information is complicated. Frankly, reading it is difficult because of the way it's laid out. And so it's a very sort of basic seminar. And I always say it's a value-free seminar. It's essentially your guide to figure out, and it'll help you.
I've been through that.
Yes,
I know.
Exactly.
I'm chuckling because even after the explanation, it's still really hard. And some of the people up there, and some of the agencies don't understand it as well as they should.
I think one of the interesting things about state government is that I think people understand their
little segment.
Or you'll find 2 or 3 things that you're interested in, and you know them really well, and then you'll find. But putting the whole picture together, I mean, the state government spends $5 billion, and the state budget is going on 1,000 pages, and that's just the numbers part of it. And there's a narrative part of it that's another few hundred pages, and it's no one can understand all of it.
Well, I think people don't even understand why you have HB1 and HB2.
That's exactly right. And they're, anytime we talk about the budget, there's always this discussion about, for people tuning in, HB1 is the budget, and so is HB2. HB1 is the part of the budget, House Bill number 1, which is essentially numbers. It's a big, giant spreadsheet. It may as well have been written in Excel. In fact, I think there's an Excel version when the governor presents hers. But to accomplish that, you have to do all sorts of things in the narrative. You have to change laws, you have to add things, and then you add other stuff in too. And that becomes House Bill 2, which is still the budget, sometimes called the trailer bill. Interesting trivia that we call them today HB 1 and HB 2, but it's only the last 15 or 20 years that that was true. It used to, the numbers they got used to be random and inconsistent. Might be HB 486 one year,
really?
HB 291.
I didn't know that.
Discovered that one day looking stuff
Trying
up
to
in an
trace
old
it back.
budget, and I'm like, hey, wait a minute, there's no HB1. What happened here? They didn't always call it that. We don't always do things the same way every year in government.
Well, that's true in more ways than one.
Yeah.
Well, as long as we're talking about budget, what do you think of this year's budget? I mean, it's going all over the place. You have the governor making one presentation, the House coming up with some other idea, some major things were not in it that the governor wanted, and now the Senate's working on it, and it's got a lot of other things.
It's interesting, because I think, we were talking off air about this too, that I think that it's going to be different this year. We're very used to, in New Hampshire, a situation where the House and Senate are, in the legislature anyways, in rough agreement. Even if the governor's a little bit different, those two organizations are in rough agreement. That's not true this year. So what happens in the process, the House does a version of the budget. They then pass it over to the Senate to do. The Senate will change it and do its own version of the budget. They may start from scratch. Usually what happens is they make some changes. Then they come together in June in what's called a conference committee, where people sit down and they hammer out the differences. Well, normally what we're used to is governor presents a budget and the House goes, yeah, we're going to do a lot of what that is, and we're going to make some changes here and there, and it evolves a little bit, but it's not that different. And that's sort of true this year, except in a couple of key areas it's not. But and then it goes over to the Senate, they make some more changes, and frankly 90% of the changes are progressive, and they end up agreeing to, and it's not that complicated. This year there's going to be a fight. The Senate is dead set on doing some things and not doing others, that the House is dead set on the opposite on. And so the question is, what happens? Because they're different parties, they don't agree, and we're not known in America these days for resolving our differences very easily. So I think it's going to make for a very interesting June.
Yeah, I guess so. It's not an easy compromise to make between gambling and no gambling, number one.
Well, that's one big thing.
Yeah.
In fact, I think gambling, if you think about it, what's going on in Concord right now, a lot of discussion on the budget, a lot of discussion on gambling. The House, and I think this was very sensible, I don't agree with a lot of their budget, but this I do agree with. The House looked at it and said, you know what, we haven't passed gambling. There's no authorizing legislation for gambling in the budget. We're going to do a budget without that money in it, and then consider that bill separately, because it's on the other side of the State House right now. So they passed a budget without gambling in it. The Senate, my understanding at this point, is looking at the budget and saying, you know what, the House will not have, they passed gambling, they're all in favor of it, and they would ordinarily have put about $80 million in the budget for that. And they said, well, they're not going to do that if the House hasn't passed it yet. Well, the House isn't going to vote before they have to have a budget done. So I think it's not going to be in either budget. And you can argue whether that's a good idea or not. I think it's good because it's not in the budget. We're going to debate it, and people in the audience will have differing views on this. But I think it's a big change. We can admit to that. Definitely. And if we're going to debate it, isn't it a good idea to debate it sort of standalone and say, do you want gambling? Do you not want gambling? And that way nobody's sort of boxed into saying, well, I don't want gambling, but I like this other thing. And and vice versa. So it's decided on its own merits.
Well, yeah, let's see how the law is written, too. I mean, that was always a problem that I had with it. In the 4 years I was up there, I voted against the gambling, mainly because I didn't like the bill, the way it was written.
Yeah, okay.
It wasn't open up enough to anybody who wanted to go in. I felt it was always wired, it seemed, to one area or another, or maybe one or two areas. And there was not enough written in there to control it, enough controls. And they were going to try to rush it all through. And I thought that's going to be a mistake. No,
if you're going to have it, you want some control. And frankly, one of the concerns that has been expressed is there's this notion, there's a very active group surrounding the Salem site. There's a site, the old Rockingham Park racetrack, where there's a group called Millennium, I think it's called, gambling, who would, or gaming, I think. If you like it, you're supposed to say gaming, and I don't care what you call it, but it's the same thing. But if you
it's like the lottery isn't gambling?
The lottery isn't gambling? I kind of think it is. No, if you have a system. I listened to a guy once in a donut shop explain to me how, no, you got to have a system, because if a 12 came up last week, it won't come up next week. And I said,
Okay.
pretty sure that's not true.
No.
Let me explain to you how randomness works. But there's this thought that Salem sort of has an inside track, because it's the thing everybody's familiar with. I don't know if that's true. My reading of the bill, I don't see that personally. There are some people who say it is, but I don't want to claim to be an expert on whether it is or not. There may be some clause in there that I'm not familiar with what it means, and it turns out that, well, actually that means it can only really be there because no one else is close enough to the interstate or something.
That's what I was worried about, because I read that into the previous bills, that there was certain wording that only one would qualify, or two would qualify.
It would certainly be a leg up in their direction.
That's right. Now, if then, and who makes the choices? How independent are they? Are they, or do they have favors that they have to pay back?
Well,
I don't know.
It's a good question, and and frankly, I think that's the problem. The Senate was very much in favor of this bill. The discussion in Concord right now, anyway, is that, well, somebody said this week that there's a special committee of the House, which they tried to have balanced. And they said, if you look at the committee of the House, and this is a supporter was saying this, about 20 are in favor, 20 are against, and 5 are completely undecided. And even now, after weeks of hearings, I think that's a good description of where the House as a whole is.
I agree with you, from what I'm reading anyway.
Well, if you talk to people who are up there, both sides will say to you, I feel good about our chance. Not completely confident, but I feel good. Well, they both feel good. But there are a lot of people who aren't strongly committed one way or the other. Even if I ask you today, well, what do you think? Well, I'm kind of leaning against it. You might switch.
Yeah.
And I would say that at this point, there's probably 70-ish people who could flop either way at the end of the day.
I'm just wondering, because, again, another thing I'm reading in the paper is that Millennium's promising all sorts of little extras now to sort of swing the deal.
Well,
restaurants and entertainment and all this sort of stuff. And I thought that was one of the negatives, that they were going to draw away from the local organizations that have that.
It's interesting. I would think if I were local, I would want them to just do gambling and not have restaurants and shopping, because I want people to leave and shop at my place. But apparently the local community there, Salem voted during their town elections. They had a non-binding referendum. Although it should be noted that one of the criteria at the end of the day is going to be local support, that you will not be able to build a casino in a town unless the town says it's okay too, I assume in a referendum. But they had overwhelming 3-to-1, 4-to-1 support for it. I want to say 75%.
So they're not worried about that.
Apparently the people there want it, and they think they can finesse that. And some of it may date to, that town has experience with a in its heyday, Rockingham Park was a big thing. It isn't anymore, so we forget that. But back in the '60s, it was huge.
And these number of things that people went to were more than just Rockingham Park.
Yeah, they would leave the site, and I don't know when the mall came.
Oh, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be.
It should be a good bill, but I think at the end of the day, it'll have a limited effect on the budget itself, which is good. If we're thinking about money, in fact, this is one thing I would want your audience to think about carefully. Whether you support gambling or you don't support gambling, you need to think a little bit about how the money is going to be spent.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important because gambling revenues or gaming revenues are a little bit more up and down than a lot of taxes. Most taxes we have, and there are some exceptions to this, kind of creep up a little bit every year. Some years they creep up a little bit more. Some years they just creep up a little or flat. But very few of them bounce.
Yeah.
You have a 50% drop. Gambling revenues are a little more up and down than that. And because it's a less steady revenue source, I don't want to use it for the general fund, the general operating budget of the state. I don't want to pay for ongoing regular expenses with a revenue source that's unstable. Let's dedicate it to something.
Do you favor this suggestion that it be dedicated to infrastructure?
I think that it's not a bad idea. I mean, we have.
I mean, that's something that could go up and down.
There's a significant infrastructure problem in the state. There's no question that the revenues we currently use to pay for roads in particular are flat and are not even keeping up with inflation. And so that's a scary situation because we're going to, you know, I can't predict the future, but I'm guessing we're all going to have cars still. That's my hunch.
What are they going to run on?
Yeah, but what are they going to run on? That's another question. But, right, so let's say you had, you know, $100 million this year. You pave $100 million of roads. If it goes down to 80, well, then next year you pave $80 million of roads. So I like that connection. I worry a little bit at some point if there's a big pot of money there. You know how legislators are.
Oh.
Well, everybody will say, you know what, I know that's great, but what if we took 10% of it and did this with it? Oh, yeah, that's good. And another 5% for this. And then, well, oh, yeah, and what about the North Country? So, for example, the gambling bill has a provision in it for North Country economic development, mostly infrastructure, dedicated, I like that, and economic development in the North Country. Well, first of all, I don't know what that means. I don't know what you spending on. I know what economic development looks like, but I don't know what money you spend to get it. So that's a question. The other thing is, what's the North Country? How do you define that? I mean, if you know, if you're
county, 3 counties.
If you're Nashua, it might be Merrimack. But
for the Merrimack visitors.
Right.
We don't get shown in there. They have to look at. They have to really look at this program.
Yeah.
So don't worry
Well, they
about that.
define it as the northern third of the state.
Yeah.
So I
Where is
asked
the cutoff?
4 different people, what's the northern third of the state? Where is it?
Yeah.
And they said, well, I guess that's probably the 4 counties up north.
Yeah.
And I said, no, that's 45% of the state by land mass. And they're like, oh, well, where's the line? I'm like, I don't know. Does Hanover count?
Yeah.
Does Plymouth count? And, you know, which town? And it's not defined, just the northern third.
And economic development hasn't been well defined for the state anyway.
Right.
Hopefully, this new commissioner has something in mind that'll activate that whole thing, because that has really not been an effective tool for the state.
Well, no, I think if we look, if you look going forward and say, what are the challenges of the state? Jobs are the biggest challenge. Job growth for the last 10 years has been, the number of jobs in the state of New Hampshire is flat. And if you look at, I think over 10 years, we grew by like 0.1% or something. So essentially flat. Whereas the previous decade, it was up 10 or 12%. If everybody's got a job, a lot of other things are better. If nobody has a job, a lot of other things are worse. And at the end of the day, that's what everybody wants. And you know, you talk about young people leaving the state for jobs. You want to keep them home, have more jobs. Some of them won't, some of them won't stay, some of them will. But that has to be it. I'm optimistic about the new commissioner.
I'm going to ask you something aside.
Yeah,
Well,
sure.
I didn't intend to originally, but have you heard of Fred Coker's program to try to tie in education with job growth and things? What do you think of that? I just heard about it.
I don't know a lot about exactly what he's trying to do, so I don't want to comment on the particulars of the program. But you know, Fred Coker, and some people in the audience will remember Fred has been a long-time businessman and business advocate and business journalist, frankly.
And head of the High Tech Council.
Head of the High Tech Council. I think he's still head of the High Tech Council. Is there a connection between education and economic development? There has to be, right? Because if you talk to businesses today, one of the issues they have is education shouldn't be a training program. You know, you don't go to college to be an apprentice in something, but you go to learn, and the skills that you have to have learned, the education you have to have coming out, you need to know, you know, why do we take math? Not because the math you take is going to apply to this job, but because whatever you do, you're going to need to have a base of knowledge so that I can train you to do a job. And you talk to a lot of businesses in New Hampshire today, and they will say, we have jobs that we can't hire anyone for. We want to, but we can't. I heard a stat the other day from somebody at Microsoft that they have 100,000, this is nationally, they have 100,000 jobs that they can't fill that are, they want you to have a bachelor's in computer science, and they would start you at 6 figures. And they can't fill them. And I'm at this briefing, and I raised my hand, and I said, will you train somebody who's a little older? But we need to, we need to be in a position where they
Sure.
can fill those 100,000
Sure,
jobs. So
definitely.
education has a value.
Yeah, well, I agree with it. I think that's something, I had worked for DuPont, retired from DuPont
sure.
Merck, and they do a very good job in trying to bring the science teachers down there to Wilmington, Delaware. They actually even sponsor a number of them nationwide to go to the science secondary teachers conference. So that's what you want the companies to do, just to make sure that, and also to get the students to be aware of some of this stuff. I think there's no real, they don't go outreach to the students early enough.
I think it's important that, people talk a lot about, the importance of, let's just say, science in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but there's an importance of, to be good at science in ninth grade.
Mm-hmm.
You don't start in ninth grade. You start in second grade, third grade, fourth grade, and at some point we need to recognize that the future involves a lot of technology. And there aren't a lot of jobs, there aren't a lot of good jobs that you can get or that you're going to be able to get in 10 years. If you don't have a background where you have these skills and these capabilities, and
I mean, it's not just the computer scientists or the person building a rocket or something like that. It's our medical people too.
Oh,
and,
no,
and all the other support people that have to get a complete education.
If you think about, if you're in a hospital or a doctor's office, but particularly, larger hospitals, the knowledge that it's not like there's a doctor who knows a lot of stuff and everybody else is just helping him. I mean, the number of things that everybody in that chain of care have to be able to do is really stunning, and the level of knowledge that you have to have just to be a nurse at even at a more basic level is really striking.
Definitely. Well, let's get back to the budget.
Yes, let's get back to the budget.
But that was
we can't solve the global problems.
Okay. So what about the health care part of it? That's another big section of the budget that is sort of up in the air. Medicare expansion, Obamacare, the Medicaid operation. What do you think is going to happen
there are a lot of questions, and well, let me look at two things that are separate. But I'm going to start with Medicare and then talk a little bit about some of the Medicaid enhancement tax issues that we're having. Medicare expansion, though, Medicaid expansion that we're focused on, that Obamacare gives us an option on. I would say a year ago, a lot of people would have looked at this and said, well, it's a no-brainer. Probably the federal government's going to cover most of the costs that are probably going to occur. And I think I probably believe them. And so let's just expand it because it's not really going to cost us anything except way down the road. A lot of people are taking a second look at that for a variety of reasons. Not because they look at people and say, I don't want to help anybody. But they look at a lot of experiences around the country. One is, does the federal government keep its promises? The federal government has said, I don't want to do this. Or the federal government has said, we want you to do this. We don't want it to cost you anything. We're going to pay 100% of the costs. The federal government doesn't usually pay 100% of the costs when they say. We know on this program that actually when the president had a budget proposal about 5 months ago at this point, he originally said, you know what? Even now, before it starts, I'm going to switch and we're going to adopt something called a blended rate, which would blend a bunch of rates and amounts to essentially less money. We're still going to give you most of the money, and that's how it starts. We're going to give you most of the money, not all of the money. Interestingly, a bunch of left-wing think tanks in Washington came out and attacked him for cost shifting to the states, and he backed away from that. But we already know he wants to. And as I said to a friend of mine, the guy who's most committed to this expansion, who most wants to do it, is the first guy starting to talk about cutting back the funding for it. So what do you think the people who are less committed to it are going to do? And it's not that people don't care, but we make decisions every day. I said to a state senator I was on the radio with one day, I said, listen, it's not that I don't care. When you were in office, you never proposed expanding Medicaid. And it's not because you don't care about people. It's because you said we have limited resources and here's how we're going to dedicate them. That's all we're saying. I think that's going to be a big issue. I think the Senate is going to look at it and say, we need a great deal more commitment from the federal government on what happens, and what the hospitals are going to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the debt is increasing, so people have to pay attention to it. So you're right; they're going to cut back on who's going to pay the money.
At some point, a friend of mine wrote something nationally and said, if the states that have not adopted Medicaid expansion yet say no and don't adopt it, the federal government will save almost $1 trillion. And it's I think it's actually more like 600 and something billion dollars. But they said this is, saying no to the money is something you can do to save them the money, because they can't help themselves. I mean, nationally we pay for 2/3 of the spending with taxes, and we borrow the other third. It's not like we borrow a little bit. I mean, it's getting to the point where we're almost borrowing half. I mean, it's only 1/3, but it's going up every year. So at some point you have to look back and say no.
Well, what about the cost savings that's supposed to be coming with the way they organize Medicaid? Is that going to?
The proposal was to switch to a managed care format, and in a way that they thought would save some money. Managed care doesn't always save money in Medicaid, but there was a thought that it would. There are implementation issues with that, and one of them relates to the New Hampshire hospitals. And the hospitals were concerned because every year, the amount of money they get for a particular service gets ratcheted down. And it's not keeping up with their inflation costs or anything, so it's not clear exactly how much, but a hospital will tell you that they get 30 or 40 cents on the dollar for a Medicaid patient. If they have too many Medicaid patients, they lose money and go to business. If they have enough, they can be absorbed by charging the rest of us more. We keep going down. There's a lawsuit where they're suing over the way the rate reductions were done as far back, I think, as 2007 and 2008, where the governor at the time, John Lynch, and his people said, we need to save the money, just ratchet them down. And there's procedures you have to go through, and they're not. That lawsuit's still outstanding. Medicaid managed care doesn't work unless the hospitals say they're going to take it. And so that's up in the air. One of the other factors that's affecting them is the big issue, one of the big issues, I think, in the budget this year, in the House and Senate disagreement. We have a program called Medicaid Enhancement Tax, where we essentially tax the hospitals and then divide the money up and give them the money back. And there's a federal Medicaid match to it, so they get back, or at least they did until 2 years ago, more or less every dime they paid. So they said, yeah, that's fine. We changed that program, and they started keeping track of how much they were paying. And instead of saying, yeah, I'll pay you whatever you want, they said, well, all right, no, this counts, and this doesn't count, and this counts. And so we ended up getting less than we thought because they were getting a lot less back, and it was a huge cost to them, so they wanted to reduce that. The governor would like to bring that back. A lot of people would like to bring back some of that. But her estimates for how much is going to be raised gross by the tax are about $450 million for the year, and the amount of money we raised last year was more like $350 million. The difference is about $120 million, whatever the exact numbers are. And if you have $120 million less, you're going to give them less money back, maybe $120 million less back. And the federal government's not going to match that as well. And so the real difference in the budget is $200 million, probably, give or take. And that's a hole in the budget that needs to be fixed or changed.
That's one of the big things that they're going to be playing with.
Frankly, I think that is going to be the biggest fight between the House and Senate is over those numbers. And the numbers in the House budget are not realistic.
Well, what that bothers me a little bit, I don't know if you read the Telegram today, but they had this comparison of the hospitals, what they charge for major operations.
Right.
And there's a discrepancy. In fact, nationwide, it can be a factor of 2 or more difference in just an imaging process. And St. Joseph, I don't think, is going to be doing very well because they came out on the high side of almost everything in that comparison. But it's almost like they have 2 sets of books, one for Medicaid patients and one for, and for the hospital plans, and then one for the patient who doesn't have any insurance.
Well, in fact, I think there are more sets of books than that.
Really?
There's a Medicaid price because it's what the federal government will pay for Medicaid, what the state government will agree to pay for Medicaid. There's a Medicare price, which is usually higher, which is what the federal government will agree to pay. And then because of how those two relate to the actual cost, there's a price that private insurers have to pay. But most private insurers will negotiate with every provider. So Anthem will negotiate an Anthem price. Cigna will negotiate a Cigna price. Harvard Pilgrim will negotiate a Harvard Pilgrim price. And then there's another price still for cash payments, which tend to be almost no people. But I had a friend of mine who has an HSA plan, so a lot of stuff is out of pocket. He had a procedure done. He got a bill. He got another bill, and there are different prices. He called around, and at the hospital he went to, he had a bunch of different people saying, oh, no, it's $186. Well, no, call that department because I think it's only $143. And he went back and forth. Finally, he found somebody, a friend of his, this is in a different state, but who knew what they were doing and said, here's what you do. You call this department at this number and tell them that you're a cash pay patient and that you can only afford this many dollars, and that's what they'll accept. So he did that. That's not pricing. Yeah. So how do you resolve that? The state government about 2 years ago went to a system. They have a new program. I think it's called Compass, where they for major procedures that aren't emergency. So this isn't like if you need an angioplasty, but it's if you need a hip or you need something that you're going to schedule a couple weeks in advance. It might even be gallbladder surgery. They will send you a list of. They will send you the low-cost provider. They're not going to force you to go to the low-cost provider, but if you do, they'll give you a rebate of $100 or whatever it is. If you save them money, they'll save you money. It's actually not a bad idea. Yeah. Because if this hospital's $800 and this hospital's $1,400, then shouldn't we share some of the $600 savings? At some point, when you get consumers involved in the process on that level, nobody thinks you're going to comparison shop angioplasties. Yeah. Doc, I'm having a heart attack. How much do you charge? But on a lot of other things, you can.
Yeah. Well, that's what another thing that bothered me is people who want a single-party payer, the government, say Medicare is doing such a good job, but they pay back at these different rates. Yeah. You would think that they would have some way of, hey guys, you're 40% higher than Joe down the street from you. We're going to direct all the Medicare patients to that kind of hospital.
Well, it's you'll hear talk sometimes about how the administrative costs of Medicare are so much lower than private insurance. Well, partly because private insurance is constantly tracking things like that, and so there's an administrative cost to that. If you're the government provider, it's a lot cheaper for you not to worry about it.
Well,
and just shrug your shoulders.
Is it cheaper?
It's not cheaper. It's easier for them.
It's easier. It's less administrative cost, right? But it's not cheaper to the overall.
Healthcare needs to get into a position where you and I have some knowledge, have some sensitivity to what we know what we're paying.
That's right. When you have low co-pays and things like that, you don't care. Somebody else is paying the big part.
I had a great example with my mother-in-law. They had a prescription plan. My mother-in-law and father-in-law, they had a prescription plan where they paid a percentage of the cost of every prescription. They paid like 20% of the total cost. Well, I picked up their prescriptions for them because I'd go to Shaw's for this, and I'd go to the prescription center for this, and went to 3 different places with 3 different, because this one was cheaper here. Their company switched to a 5, 10, 25 plan where it's $10, or for everything they had it was $10. And well, they don't care now. I get them all at Shaw's on the way. Different place now, but I got them all at the same place. The prescription company was paying more, but what does my mother-in-law care? It's $30 to her either way.
That's right. That's where you have to have somebody that's sensitive to the total cost.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So there's no hope for our budget, but
there's hope for the budget, but it's going to be sausage making at its best.
Sausage making at its best. Well, you heard it here. It's not first, but there must be some other areas too that you think. Are we going to do anything with our infrastructure? Are we going to do anything with our education?
Well, there's on a couple of those issues. There's a huge debate over the gas tax.
Right.
And then, because the gas tax was fixed in 1991 at 18 cents, and it hasn't changed since, and it's pennies per gallon. So many of our other taxes are 6%.
Right.
Well, 6% of the cost of a hamburger is the hamburger's price went up over the last 22 years, and the gas tax didn't. And so, just to give you an idea, gas tax has been flat. Revenues have been flat, more or less, for the last 10 years. I think they've gone up 1.5%. Inflation's gone up 23%. What do you do about that? Well, David Campbell from Nashua has a grand plan to raise the tax in specific ways and then create a dedicated fund within a dedicated fund of that money that only fixes bridges and infrastructure. It's actually, it's a great plan. It's a good idea to try to fix some of our infrastructure. The problem he's running into, the opposition he's running into, is that, and this is sort of the counter side of that argument, we don't have enough money to pay for our roads. That's true. So therefore, we should raise the gas tax? Maybe, but the opposition says, listen, for you're a lawyer making $100,000 a year driving an SUV, this is no big deal to you. But if you're living on the economic margin and you're you're driving a 15-year-old used car, mine's only 10, and that you and getting back and forth from work, you don't have a lot of extra.
Yeah.
And $100, $200 a year is a lot extra for you. And so the regressivity during a time when there's no economic turmoil isn't working. The House is very supportive. The Senate appears to be very hostile. I don't end up seeing that happening.
Well, is there any other way of getting some kind of money into the infrastructure?
Well, the Senate would suggest you use gambling for it. And that's a way that you can do it at the end of the day. I mean, I'm not sure at the end of the day, there's car registration fees are the other major source of funding. I think car registration fees are probably more regressive than the gas tax. And I like a system where we fund infrastructure, we fund the roads with taxes and fees that are related to them. If you don't drive...
More turnpikes?
Well, I don't know about that. But the turnpike system is flush, for example. Yeah. But if you think about the gas tax, if you don't drive, you don't pay the gas tax. You do drive, you do pay the gas tax. Are there regressivity issues? Yes. Can we address them? Probably. But I think that's just not going to happen this year. It's just too much now. And the debate over gambling clouds it, I think, frankly.
Are they going to be able to trim any of the people who also take some of that gas money? They're going to change that? They're going to get that through?
There's, there was a bill passed in 2008 that started ratcheting that backwards. And, there's some discussion now over what counts and what doesn't count in that. We've actually done some work on this about how much of it is going to... There are two kinds. There's diversion and there's diversion. So the Department of Safety gets a lot of it. It's capped at about 28% of gas tax receipts. And people say we shouldn't be diverting it to the Department of Safety. Well, part of it should be going to the Department of Safety.
It's the state police.
The constitutional amendment says supervision of traffic thereon on the roads as one of the... So it contemplates using gas tax receipts to pay for troopers. There's a question about, are we paying just for troopers, or are we paying for more than that? So there's some...
Well, there's some administrative costs, for ticket processing, for jail sentences. And
all of that, I think I'm okay with. There's a level at which you're like, okay, that works, okay, that works, okay, that works. At one point, cultural resources got money. They don't anymore. I think for the historical markers on the roads, well, they're on the roads. I think that's too far. And I think that a little common sense can get us to where less and less is being diverted. But
okay, well, what about education? What do we do there?
Education, the two big things that are being debated right now are there's a school choice tax credit program that's I'm going to say just starting. It hasn't even started. It's for the September school year. It's actually under attack constitutionally, and the ACLU is fighting it. Although that court case could go either way, but I think at the end of it, school choice will be upheld. Governor wants to get rid of those. The Senate doesn't. In the first year, the program looks like it's only going to be a couple $100,000, and it's businesses who take a tax credit for donations they make directly to a private scholarship organization. I think that's going to survive, partly because it's a small program. But I think mostly because it hasn't, and I should say, and someone in your audience will know this, my organization was a big supporter of this program. We think rich people have school choice, poor people generally don't. They have one choice, and I think having 2 or 3 choices is a better thing for everybody. But I think it's going to pass partly because it hasn't happened, so let's see if it works or not. The other issue is charter schools.
Yeah.
And the House passed, although I don't know that they really believe this, but they passed it, a moratorium, essentially. They would fund charter schools at current levels and no more. Well, they're growing because they're doing very well. For example, there's one in Nashua, the Academy in Science and Design, which is
excellent.
Yeah, out 101A. It's a great school. They're doing really well because they're successful. They have many, many more people who want to go than can get in. Although there's an existing cap in the charter. The charter that has to be approved tells you how many students you can accept. But we want more schools like that. And there are 5 or 6 that are ready to open, that are ready to go, and then this moratorium is stuck in the budget. Senate doesn't want that. The Senate wants an experience that wants to approve some of these. They want alternative schools for people to experience different things. The governor wants it too. The governor's budget called for full charter school funding, and the Senate wants it. My general sense, the House doesn't have it in, but the very political guy who was chairman of that part of the Finance Committee said, we're going to keep it in we're going to take it out and use it as a bargaining chip.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Dan Eaton happens to be his name. And I think at the end of the day, people are going to look at it and say, you know what, I get that there's a lot of horse trading in politics. Why don't we not do it with schools? Yeah. Why don't you not, and sure. I don't want to overly fault the guy. He was honest about something people might do sort of without telling you, but it's wrong. If the governor wants something and the Senate wants something, it's probably going to happen.
Good. Well, I think I've been to that academy, and it's excellent. I mean, I don't know how many classes you've watched there, but I've been there a couple of times.
I was very impressed. So been sort of familiar with it through the years.
And the teachers are so enthusiastic about it, and the students
and the kids. Geez,
they regulate themselves. Isn't it nice to see kids?
It is nice. It's what makes me sad. We talked a little bit about its admission by a lottery process because they have more students applying than they have, and the administrator was telling me that it's very hard. They do their lottery publicly, to be completely transparent, and the kids who don't get selected, it's very hard on them, and it just breaks your heart. Yeah. Because they feel like they're doomed.
Yeah. And having a choice in education, I think. I look back. I happened to go to some very good schools. They were ranked very high, but I was very fortunate. I saw problems. First thing you do when you move around, at least like I did, is to find out what the schools are like. And you don't get any direct answers, but you get subtle answers from some people that, well, they don't get their reports in on time. Okay, don't go to that school.
I know what that means. Yeah.
But
you don't want to live in that town. You want to live in this town.
Yeah, right. But how else do people have a choice? And
some people can move.
Yeah.
Some people, and for some people, it's more possible economically to move than others. For a lot of people, it's not. And I, in New Hampshire, we're privileged to have pretty good public schools in almost every area. But pretty good isn't good for everybody. There's no one school that's going to be the perfect school for 100% of the kids in that zip code. And, we, for a variety of historical reasons, assign schools based on zip code. Well, that doesn't necessarily work for everybody. There's a reason that real estate ads say such and such school district. And because they know that that's a selling point, and we just more people who don't have that means to move as frequently as they want should have that choice.
Yeah, well, sometimes they have to get after their school boards too.
I'm not opposed to that. I mean, take care of yourself. That's a good idea.
That's right. Yeah, because I see that. I mean, I don't have any kids in school anymore, but I can see that in the city of Nashua that there are different levels out there, and we don't challenge our Board of Education enough to shape up.
Well, a lot of change comes from, if nobody's saying anything, then nothing ever changes. A lot of people are complaining, particularly constructively. Change is more likely to happen. That's just sort of a truism of life in a lot of areas.
Well, do you think that there'll be ever any kind of contracts that will go out with being able to evaluate the progress in a school, not only district, but even down to the individual school?
I think that at the end of the day, part of it is the kind of society we live in with the internet and with all of the access to information that we may not have had before, that you're going to reach a point where there's more and more information available. I mean, we're talking about things now where, a state like Massachusetts is testing every school all the time with fairly rigorous by national standards tests. And, and Massachusetts isn't always on the cutting edge of these things. In this case, they are. I think you're going to get to the point where your kids will be tested more often. You'll have some knowledge of what happens at that school. And I know testing isn't the be-all and end-all, but it's a less relative mechanism of looking at something. And if every kid in the school starts out in the 95th percentile and they stay in the 95th percentile, that doesn't tell you much. But if I remember somebody running for office said once, his daughter started out in the 35th percentile, and 3 years later she was in the 68th percentile or something like that. And he said that's progress. That's, I'm really happy with that. I'm not saying, well, geez, because the way percentiles work, there's, you can't have everybody at 100. That's because it's a ranking. But progress is what he was looking for, and he thought that's great, and he sensed it. Because it wasn't just somebody going, no, she tries really hard and does really well. It's like, okay, no, I can track that. Yeah. We'll have more information. I think in the end of the day, all that information is helpful.
Well, this excuse they have, though, of trying to teach to the test, I don't think that has to be relevant. I mean, you get tested once a year, let's say, not 5 times a year. And how long does it take you to just get people acclimated to the test, just to format, because it's probably a little different than everyday test. I mean, you're testing kids anyway in your subjects.
If you're complaining about teaching to the test, that's only a sign of a bad test. Yeah. Because it means you have to teach them something you don't want them to learn. And that's ridiculous. A good test is, you test a kid in math and you teach the test means you teach them math. Yeah. And they have to know certain things. That's and there are very few people who complain about that. Nobody, advanced placement tests, for example, are a test. And if you take an AP class in high school, you're taking a class that ultimately will end up in that test. On some level, that's teaching to the test. No one ever complains about that teaching to the test. Why? Because it's a competency in a subject area, and it's a good test. The teaching to the test is usually a smokescreen. In very rare cases, it just means there's a really bad test. Yeah. So fix the test. Don't stop testing.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they had that way back when I went to school in the 50s, and that's the New York State. They had a Regents test where if you wanted a Regents scholarship, you had to pass the test, and that was statewide. And that was very well accepted throughout the country.
I think that's actually, there's not a lot of talk about this in New Hampshire, but some sort of a graduation-based examination where and I think the way it works, at least today with the Regents diploma, is you can get a regular diploma or you can get a Regents diploma. Right. And it just means that you passed a test. Well, future employers or colleges will know that regardless of everything else, you passed these certain tests in these certain areas. I think that's not necessarily a bad idea here. It gives parents and it gives people who are reporting some sort of certainty that we have some sense of what your knowledge base is. I agree that tests themselves are not the be-all and end-all. It's not the only thing, but it's something that's not subjective, that's not relative. I don't have to take somebody's word for it. It's sort of down in black and white.
Well, that's what the SAT and the ACT scores, and but there are different types of tests. I agree that certain tests, some people do better than other tests. Sure. But so you do a little mixing in it. Have a test with the...
It's not a bad idea. It's a good idea.
I always solving all the problems. Any problems left?
I think we'll fix them all. That's what we should do.
Well, we're going to have you back again sometime in June.
We'll see what happens.
I don't know, just before or just after, whatever we can do.
I'd look forward to coming back.
Schedule.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have anything lined up coming up?
I mean, frankly, over the next 2 months, we're keeping our eye on what's going on in Concord all the time. That's really the big thing. It's a very busy time every 2 years in state government. It's a very important time in state government because most of what the state does is in that one document or two documents. That's done only once every 2 years.
It is. It's different. It's an experience, and just how our readers, our listeners, look at it and read your column on Wednesday. Right?
That's what they should do. Buy the Union Leader every Wednesday when I have a column.
Okay, and thank you for listening in to us. Don't forget that the People's View is sponsored by the Nashua Republican City Committee. We have a website, nashuagop.org. Look on there for a schedule. We meet every second Thursday of the month at the Crown Plaza, and we have a number of speakers. Please look at our website and decide and come to join us for an interesting evening of further discussion. And tune in People's View in the future. Thank you very much for listening in. And thank you.
Thank you.